Some 40 plus years ago, Sherry Kohler Fox, at that point one of the sterling Jewish educators in North America, now a rabbinical colleague and much farther along in life, but still one of the sterling educators in North America, asked Peretz Prusen, one of my seminary classmates and also one of the sterling educators in North America, if you were a bar mitzvah tutor, and I cringe when I hear that phrase, but we'll go with it. If you were a bar mitzvah tutor and you had a second line of work, what would it be? He said, I don't know, catering? Photographer? She said, Sherry, you have something in mind. If I were a bar mitzvah tutor and I had another line of work, what would it be? And she told him, you'd be a contractor. Because nobody makes a bar mitzvah for their kid without remodeling the house. It was a springboard in that case to discuss the conundrum of bar and bat mitzvah, the continually was hitherto and ever since least well understood or concept of American Jewish life. And the emphasis was, it's not about a young adult, an incipient young adolescent attaining their majority and taking their full place in the community. It's a rite de passage for the parents to show what they can afford to pay for in their early 40s. Between the overblown bar mitzvah reception at the country club, the life-size photographic cutout of the kid, the Leonards of Long Island candles on the birthday cake ceremony that adds another hour to the proceedings, and remodeling the house. It's all about showing what you are as a grown-up somewhere in your early 40s. Look what I can afford to pay for. So it broached a question for me. I don't know how it came up in my thinking this week, but what do you got to do to look like a grown-up, to look established, to have put down roots? Not for us as individuals, but for us corporately, collectively, on the local branch of the household of Israel as an institution. Now, in the old country, when Jews had no civil rights, no Jews had no social status, and where the Jewish community was completely self-regulating and self-funding, we invented the thing that the neighbors called the United Way. We call it the Jewish Federation. In the old country, they called it Kahal, the community. And the Kahal funded a whole variety of institutions. The mikveh, the ritual bath, so that married women could go and immerse themselves and there would be a new generation of Jewish babies. The Kahal funded the cheder, so when those kids got to be at 3, I started Hebrew school, at 10, I learned the trade, old enough to toddle through the snow after the bigger kids who'd walk through the snow first to stamp it down, there'd be some place for those Jewish babies to go and get an education. There would have to be a kosher slaughterer funded by the Kahal, and a kosher butcher, and a kashrut supervisor to make sure they were both operating according to Hoyle, all of whom funded by the community. It used to be, 40-some years ago in Argentina, kosher meat cost the same as treif meat there, because the Jewish community paid the difference for the salary of the mashgiach, so that Jews wouldn't have an incentive to go ahead and just buy it at Lucky Mark or Winn-Dixie and get your meat where everyone else does, by virtue of the fact that it's so much cheaper. All funded by the community. The study house, the Bes Midrash, funded by the Kahal, and the synagogue, a place to study Talmud and argue, because there weren't enough books to go around, so you learned by listening to those who knew. And the synagogue, where we'd go and follow services from somebody who knew, which is why traditionally, and we touched on this before, the Shemona Esrei, the silent prayer in the middle, is traditionally repeated by the cantor. For no other purpose. In the ages before we had movable type and everyone had a prayer book to follow along, some people would never have the opportunity to know how the prayers went, so they'd learn by following along with the cantor's reprise. And the community, the Kahal, funded the cantor and funded a rabbi to teach Torah, to be an arbiter of authenticity. The Kahal funded the Bikur Cholim Society, those who would reach out and visit the sick in their home. There were no hospitals in the old country. There were no doctors. And whatever need your family had beyond what they could meet themselves, the Chevrat Bikur Cholim, The Visiting the Sick Society would be on hand and bring the resources in. They had, in the case of Grandpa Gross's village where he was born, in Podolia, they had what they called Linat HaTzedek, which I think is a marvelous thing, the hospice of righteousness. This is, frankly, in modern day terms, this was a youth group project. The kids too old to be in cheder and too young to be working for a living would go every morning and every evening to touch base with all the shut-in elderly members of the community at home, see to it that their needs were met and that they were provided for, and that they had somebody to be with them and have some social stimulation. All funded and supported by the Kahal. But here's the thing. None of these institutions is permanent. That includes the synagogue, the bathhouse, the Beis Midrash, the slaughtering abattoir. Because if the Nazis come and destroy all the Jews in Shtetl Danovka, which they did on a lovely spring morning in 1942, the neighbors are still going to slaughter livestock. They can use a slaughtering house. Everybody can take a bath in the bathhouse, and a public meeting place like the Beis Midrash or the synagogue, anybody can use. None of those institutions is permanent. There's only one. That is the Beis Olam, the house of eternity, Beit HaKavarot, the cemetery. Here is something we don't think about often. For all of Jewish history, Jews have come and gone at one time or another in literally every country on earth, and are still found in most of them. But our institutions have long gone, except for the cemetery. Around the year 1000, Prince Ivan decided to put down roots. Halfway down the Dnieper River between Turkey and Scandinavia, they founded the city of Kiev. Forgive me, I'm supposed to be patriotic and supportive of the Ukrainians by pronouncing it Kiev, but I'm an old school guy. I get it by way of Russian, by way of Yiddish. He founded the city of Kiev, and he established it by doing something very salient. He says there's Jewish merchants in Scandinavia. There's Jewish merchants on the Black Sea. I invite Jews to come live and help build my new city of Kiev and make it the capital of Ukraine. Over and over throughout the Middle Ages, Jews would be invited to a community because we were all literate, because we networked with other Jews before there was an internet, before there was a Standard & Poor, before there was a Wall Street. Jews networking with other Jews, supporting each other in our vulnerability, became a resource. And the pattern always was the local duke or noble or prince would invite the Jews into his village, his town, his city, his kingdom, over the objection of the bishop. And the Jews settled in, and you invited your cousin Manny. He happened to be married, which made you feel lonely, so you sent off for a mail-order bride. The next thing you know, you've got kids and a mikveh and a cheder and a Beis Midrash and all your other institutions. But the bishop is okay with that because as long as nobody dies, they can always put out an edict of expulsion and send the Jews away. As long as no one dies. And over and over and over throughout Jewish history, the pattern has been any institution of our community is a temporary one until someone dies. I want you to ponder that for a moment. In our little island community here, our congregation has a Beis Olam. Our house of eternity is not this room that we pray in. Our house of eternity, which is the euphemism, is up the other end of Bald Eagle, across from 7-Eleven. And what could be more Jewish? Across from the Chinese restaurant. And it meets all the requirements of a Jewish cemetery by Jewish law. On one side, there's a road. On the other side is the exterior wall facing a road. On the north side is a planted garden area that's about to be a wall next to some kind of fast food drive-through place. In other words, no other burials alongside on any one of the four sides. We have plantings defining the barrier of the outer edge of ours, and we have no burials within 4 cubits, the length of a human body, of any of the boundaries, totally insulated and self-contained. It is the only such institution in this end of Florida. The much larger Greater Naples community, of which we are effectively a part, has a dedicated, not consecrated, it's not the same thing, Jewish section in one privately owned for-profit cemetery that does not belong to any synagogue or to the Jewish community as a whole. I'd like to have you let that sink in for a moment, that in our little corner of the county down here at the bottom of Greater Naples, we have a unique facility, the like of which no one else in this corner of Florida has. And I'd like you to think of something even more abstract but compelling. Our congregation is 42, 3, just a couple of years back we were 40th. I haven't been keeping score. On the way out the door, check the plaque. But the folks that built this congregation were young, active seniors, as opposed to seniors. And in many cases, bought a retirement home in Marco, but kept the family grave up north in the family plot. And during the 10 years I'm in this community now, at least half of our congregants who have left us in that time did in fact return, like Jacob leaving Egypt to be buried in the promised land with his family, to lie with his fathers, as Jacob put it. And yet there are so many of our congregants, some of whom were already departed before I got here, who are already residing in our Beis Olam. There have been several that I've had the painful privilege of consigning there during my decade here. I want you to consider what an act of moral courage it is when you're a young, active senior to say, and I'm going to build the congregation, I'm going to pay my dues, I'm going to serve on committee, I'm going to lend my time, my talent, and my treasure to the welfare of our little slice, the local branch of the Jewish community. And yet, nobody lives forever. I'm also going to give the Jewish community a stake by buying a space in the Beis Olam and eventually lying there. Friends, it's the Jewish community institution we think about last on the list. And I'll say with tongue bleakly in cheek with a little gallows humor, the last one we end up needing too. And yet, ponder the prototype. The archetype is Avraham Avinu. This week's Torah portion, Genesis 23. Vayhi chaye Sarah me'ah shanim v'esrim shanim v'sheva shanim. The life of our matriarch Sarah was 127 years. That's her obituary. It's the paradox that the portion called the life of Sarah begins with the death of Sarah. And Abraham, who's been now a tenant, Avraham Avinu, Sarah Imenu, 72 years they've been paying rent to camp out on the outskirts of Hebron, high up in the hills south of Jerusalem. 72 years. You talk about rent to own? And yet they're still just tenants. They're transients, nav and nod, rootless and wandering. And so it's worth looking at the drama in chapter 23, the kabuki dance and the hoops that Abraham jumps through to mollify and schmeichel the Hittites, paying whatever exorbitant fee they want for a simple reason. So that now, 4,000 years later, No Israeli, no Israelite, no Zionist can be told, oh, you Jews came in as recent colonists and stole the land. Genesis 23 is our bill of sale. Our Jewish communities have done for 4,000 years what Avraham Avinu does in this week's portion, establishing the only Jewish community institution that is truly permanent. Both there, in the land of Israel, and here, and everywhere else Jews go. Let us continue always to be anchored, not by death, but by our ongoing affirmations of a community and a heritage and a people that acknowledges that death is not the last institution. The last institution is the community that closes ranks to say amen to our Kaddish when there is a death and a burial. May we continue always our ongoing dedication to what Avraham and Sarah taught us, being Amcha, being our people, and being the ones that say always,